So I wanted to talk to you because you live in Russia and you've been in all kinds of places in the world. And I wanted to sort of hear your takes in particular about sort of the intersection between like Marxism and the idea of the multipolarity, or as some people say, the multipolar world order. You know, you lived in the West. Now you don't live in the West. You know, you live in Russia. You've been through war zones. I saw your documentary, going to the Donbass. You just seem like somebody who's, pretty well traveled, a lot of people. So I wanted to sort of see where your take is on that, because from my perspective, and I imagine we'd agree, and I'm cheating a little because Lumpy did, sort of gave me the heads up, but basically sort of where I stand with this concept, right, is that there are nations in the world who are doing objectively good things for, particularly the global South, but that on its own doesn't necessarily equate to systemic and revolutionary change on a global scale.
So multipolarity itself is not that meaningful. I mean, in the late 1800s and the 1900s, we had a multipolar world with Britain colonizing half the world and France colonizing the other half. And basically, they engaged in a pattern of resource extraction and the creation of third world countries. I prefer to say third world countries over the global South because the global South sounds very sanitized. Third world countries talks about it describes the underdevelopment, the decay, the forcibly enacted poverty, the theft. So I prefer saying third world countries. So multipolarity itself is not meaningful. But however, it is meaningful if the poles that emerge are helping countries that are under the acts of the IMF and World Bank order to go get out from underneath that. Many people in the past have tried. For example, Ceausescu in Romania tried to get out of the acts of the IMF. He was shot. He was brutally shot in the head in a disgusting coup. Gaddafi tried it, and the same thing happened to it. This is not a coincidence. So right now, when we look at the other poles that are emerging, China has the Belt and Road Initiative. And they are doing what the World Bank, in theory, is supposed to do. So the World Bank allegedly gives loans in order to do development. But what they require is countries to privatize their resources, sell it off to global conglomerates, and in the end, there is no development. So third world countries are still exporting raw minerals, raw resources. So this is how the market works. It takes the most amount of labor, for example, to dig cobalt out from the ground. That takes the most amount of labor and manpower. But raw cobalt is worth about, it's a copper ore mixed with cobalt. That is worth about 50 cents a kilogram. If you just process it one level above, now you're getting about $55 a kilogram. But a lot of these African countries and countries in Asia and South America don't have the factories that will process it. So they have to export that. And then the first world countries end up exporting them back processed stuff. So raw cobalt costs 50 cents, iPhone costs $1,000. So if you are just exporting, but the amount to just dig out raw cobalt from the ground takes much more than all the steps it takes to make an iPhone, because a lot of that's automated. So that's how these countries are. So they're not able to trade because they are not getting the hard currency that is needed. And then what happens is that basically the IMF, which deals with balance of payments, gives out quote unquote loans when countries can't meet their payment. And that loan is filled with structural adjustment programs.
Yeah.
And it's pretty psychotic. I read the one they made Ukraine go under in 2014 after the coup. And basically, they required the coup government, Poroshenko's government, to lower pensions, lower minimum wage, get rid of gas subsidies. And this is actually kind of what caused the civil war in Ukraine for the past 10 years now, or 11, is that regions in the East were like, F this, we don't want lower pensions. We want, we don't want the IMF. So basically, then the Ukrainian government sent the military in, and then these people organized themselves, and Donetsk Republic Armed Militia and Luganskan Republic Militia, and they started fighting back. So in Bolivia, for example, they literally privatized the water. Even you couldn't even collect the rain. When they had the Ghani's structural adjustment programs. So what China is doing with the Belt and Road Initiative is they're giving very low interest loans that are better than the IMF, and they're not putting in IMF's structural adjustment conditions, as in you have to privatize your water, literally that, and make everyone charge people a lot of money for their water. And so then it frees up the country's resources. It allows the people to be ruled by what they want as opposed to what the IMF dictates. So IMF literally dictates countries to go change laws like A, B, C, D, F. And they are actually doing development. For example, in Congo, for decades, they were just selling raw cobalt. But in the past 5 years, China has built processing factories so that they can go up the food chain. The IMF and World Bank regime never did that. Never, ever did that. So in that way, multipolarity is helping. In a Marxist sense, it is helping the workers organize, get more benefits, also allows government to spend more on social programs and things like that. And Russia, too, it has helped the 4 countries in the Sahel region, Chad, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, get out from having French troops still occupying their country. And once they kicked out their puppet governments that were beholden to the IMF regime, what happened is that, for example, Niger used to sell its electricity its uranium for something like 50 cents a kilogram. Now they're selling it for 500 euros per kilogram.
Yeah, I remember we covered that in particular on one of our podcast episodes when Niger was basically kicking out the West from their country. And I wanted to add, on the podcast before, I've talked about the country that I'm from, talked about Guatemala. Guatemala is essentially a colony of the United States. It's an extreme right-wing government, massive human rights abuses, abject poverty, and it's the same thing is occurring that not what you're describing with China, but like with the IMF and the World Bank, where this country gets these loans that don't really go to the people like at all. It essentially stays within the government and the corporations who privatize all the resources. When Michael Parenti in his speeches talks about, there's no such thing as poor countries, I think about Guatemala, because Guatemala is a rich, rich country. If it wasn't, there wouldn't be these massive corporations there taking all the resources.
So I did a few episodes on Guatemala, and I've written some articles. And under Ronald Reagan and the death squads, they wiped out over 600 villages, like boom, killed everyone in it, including the Dos Tres massacre.
Yeah, they call it the silent Holocaust during the Civil War.
It was not silent.
I know, but they call it exactly. That's why it was silent. But no, it was not silent. My parents grew up during that war, and I'm a direct line from that conflict. But anyway, I digress. So so you were saying that Niger is now selling its uranium for, you said, 500 euros a kilogram.
Exactly. So that's a lot. Imagine how many life support systems from they can fill their hospitals with, how many schools they can build with that, how many materials they can import for anything. And so a lot of people don't understand China's relationship with the Belt and Road Initiative and the African countries are different, because the U.S. Senegal is another example. The U.S. for decades were like, oh, we're going to build and develop Dakar, and they did nothing. China went in, and if you look at the street view of Dakar, it looks so nice and beautiful, and it's very modern. Most American cities are not that modern.
Right. No, I mean, New York City is an example.
Yeah, no, Dakar looks way prettier than New York City. And like, there's no pollution, like there's no trash on the ground and things like that. No potholes. So, and Iran is also helping countries build their own refineries. For example, they worked with Venezuela so that Venezuela doesn't have to export just raw petroleum, but in fact, they can go up the food chain and get more hard currency. And the second way that multipolarity is with these particular actors is that they are getting. So right now, every country needs to store some sort of dollars into trade. And that's how the U.S. kind of gets away with being, quote unquote, a wealthy country without actually having that much industry, is because they every country storing dollars forces the dollar value up. But they are working on alternative currency systems. Like SWIFT is one example of this, a system that is basically controlled by the U.S. And Iran and Russia are currently working together to build an alternative to the SWIFT, so that countries don't have to trade in dollars and they can just kind of discard their dollars and trade in their own currency or a mix of whatever. India and Russia have been doing that for a while, where they're trading in a mix of rupees and rubles. So in those ways, multipolarity could be good, or help the working class, help bring about social change and social revolution. Because these deals with these countries, mainly China, Russia, Iran, are not subject to those awful structural adjustment programs that just keeps a country in a cycle of debt. For example, with a lot of African countries, since the 1990s, they are paying 60% of GDP in debt. That's like billions of dollars of hospitals that are not being built for people, schools that are not being built for children, things like that the government should do. And they can't, because they don't have the resources, because they're not monetarily sovereign, because of what this IMF balance sheet is doing. And sadly, the new government of Syria, the Al-Qaeda, I don't know, Al-Qaeda, ISIS government, whatever it is.
It's pretty Al-Qaeda,
Basically, yesterday, they agreed to privatize a lot of resources in order to get Syria out from under sanctions, which is exactly what the U.S. wants. So basically, Syria is going to go through the structural adjustment, the shock doctrine, as Ukraine did in 2014, which led to lowering of wages, people in poorer health. In Ukraine, for example, women are forced to be, are so poor that many of them be surrogates, like they're selling their bodies for Western fancies, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. What you're saying in regards to, particularly how these countries are aiding, how they can be aiding their world nations. And, it makes sense. Like, so going back to the example of like Niger, I remember seeing, when Niger had its essentially had its coup to oust Western government, and there's people in the streets with Russian flags and stuff. And I see people talking about, mostly liberals, being very confused as to like why that is. And I think it's one of
the Russian flag thing is very easy. If you want to get international, if there are protests that are against pro-U.S. governments, the Western media be very quiet about it. They pretend it doesn't exist. But if they put Russian flags during the time of Russiagate, boom, all these cameras are on them and they get the attention they want.
Absolutely. But I think also, like, to sort of expand on that as well, like you see that when when countries are being systemically oppressed by, the head of the imperial order, the United States, people are naturally going to look at the opposition, at least their perceived opposition of the empire, and move closer to those relationships. So it would make sense for people to be like, well, yeah, I know that Russia and the United States beef all the time, and if we fly Russian flags, we'll get media attention, or we might even get some resources from Russia. It's not.
Russia has been providing some military support for the new government, and they've also figured out how the color revolution technique works, and they're helping them, sharing intelligence to catch the color revolution attempts. So that's how they're helping the African countries. They're not developing it that much as China is, but that's because Russia doesn't have the same resources that China does to develop these countries.
For sure. So when it comes to the overall, let's say BRICS apparatus, and I guess this is sort of where I'm not necessarily making the connection, on my own, is when it comes to this competing, just for simplification, this competing market, right? Or this de-dollarization that's occurring. While, yeah, sure, on the ground in some of these instances, it's things like hospitals and schools, money, are helping these people, these workers, right? If there comes a time that these nations, and of course it goes back to right to self-determination. But if it ever comes to a point where some of these nations choose to go down, a true socialist path, a communist revolution, do you think that these countries, like Russia or South Africa or Brazil, would
China
essentially be okay with that? China, yeah.
Yes, of course. Because they don't have any capabilities of imperialism or imperial interest, and China is a Marxist-Leninist state, of course, so they'll be okay with it. And what people don't realize is that third world Marxism is very natural, because they struggle. They understand the worst of capitalism. That capitalism means children working in cobalt mines for 12 hours a day. So Marxism-Leninism is natural in third world countries. So all you need is somebody to lift the boot out from the imperial thwartling, and soon a lot more countries will become Marxist-Leninist. And they might not do it in the Bolshevik Revolution way, but they may do it more like Bolivia. Bolivia's path to socialism was that Evo Morales was elected president, and when he was president, he promised to nationalize all the oil and gas resources and create a new constitution. And Bolivia's constitution is one of the most democratic constitutions, because literally people in each community, each nation, literally citizens got together on a table and wrote provisions. And then they sent it up to the Constitution's Assembly. Yeah. And they compared all these drafts and took out things to put in things that were common, and took out things that were only one sub-assembly did it, and it went to 2-3 levels. And then when they got the resolution of the draft, they created a national referendum where people got to vote on it, and overwhelming majority voted on it. And in fact, people in Bolivia can point to little paragraphs and say, hey, I wrote that in the Constitution.
Right.
So in Bolivia, the rights of nature is enshrined in their constitution. So I mean, but afterwards, of course, they had to deal with the counter-revolution, the Santa Cruceños, the Juvenil, and the paramilitaries. In Paterreti, there was a big massacre of indigenous people. So they had to deal with that counter-revolution part, but they didn't kind of storm the proverbial Winter Palace.
Right. I was just going to say, it's kind of similar in the sense, we also did another episode on this, where sort of Mexico stands now, where right now the country seems to be moving in a much more left position without sort of the same kind of storming the castle, like you said, or the Winter Palace.
Mexico has been working more with China. One thing they did was they recognized in the previous government, was it Nieto? Not before AMLO, that was Nieto, right?
I believe so. No, I gotta look it up. But.
Yeah. Nieto didn't recognize DPRK as a country. Mexico,
Right.
and after AMLO, they started recognizing the DPRK as a country. Now they're building train lines to go from Tijuana to all the way down to Juarez. And this is the first time the country has had is having such mass public transportation. So yes, they are moving towards a social democracy, but for third world countries, just getting rid of U.S. imperialism, it leads to big jumps in quality of life.
Absolutely.
And that's enough. For example, Nicaragua also are working with China to build up their ports. Now they're wanting to build an alternative to the Panama Canal as a canal through Nicaragua, which was proposed way back when, but they decided Nicaragua was too wide, and that's why they chose the Panama Canal. And Panama is like there's a region in Panama where Panamanian law does not work. Like there's U.S. law within the canal region, and so yes, absolutely. In that, the first priority is getting rid of the imperialists who are putting the boot on the neck. And once that relaxes, any country becomes more sovereign with their currency. They are able to develop and manufacture their own equipment, so they don't have to rely on imports. And with that, there is no reason for them to take up IMF loans and subject themselves to a structural adjustment program. Then democracy just pushes in, because there's nothing constraining democracy like the IMF.
No, yeah, for sure. And again, it makes a lot of sense. And yes, I did look it up. It was Nieto, who's the former president before the last. And when you talk about like building, rail lines in Mexico, I think back about Guatemala being about the size of New York State. And it's like in that country, you could literally run train lines throughout the entire country, and people could travel so easily because when I've traveled in Guatemala, like some of the roads, especially in the mountains, are so dangerous, and it happens all the time. People will accidentally drive off cliffs or whatever because like it's if you're driving in the dark or it's raining or who knows, like there's no traveling, something that we take for granted in a lot of places in the world. When a place that's subjected by imperial boot, that is a neo-colony, doesn't have even the opportunities to do something so simple, and that goes back all the way to the days of like, before the Cuban Revolution, where if someone had to go to the hospital, and you have to basically carry somebody for 3 days and see if hopefully they make it, they make it out.
Michael Parenti had a talk about how all these hospitals were built in Cuba after the revolution, and before people would literally had to push their relatives on a horse cart or something for 4 days. But now there's a hospital in each town, so they can just go walk over there, and so many lives are being saved.
As there should be. So tell me about a little bit about your time when you went to the Donbas region. Obviously you were in. Well, actually, no, I don't know if you were living in Russia before you.
Yeah, I was.
Okay, so I guess sort of like where were your thoughts in terms of all this stuff that you're kind of explaining to me, about the world's in opposition to U.S. imperialism before and after you went to the Donbas? I
mean, with Donbas, I got to see firsthand how people were struggling. For example, in Lugansk, the Nazi paramilitary group that took over was called Tornado Battalion. They literally it's so horrific. I'm so traumatized by some of the things. One prisoner of war from Lugansk I interviewed didn't have 2 fingers because during a torture session they chopped it off. They're beastly. I even went this farmer invited me to his place, and he was digging. And then what we found was that this mass grave created by the Pravi sector, where there's like, I didn't watch how many because it was too disturbing. I did take a video. I put it on my YouTube channel. Look, there was a few dead bodies with the Pravi sector logo etched onto them with a knife. Yeah. In the first days, basically Ukraine cut off their electricity, their food. They didn't have any food, water, nothing. And so they had to then open up lines to Ossetia, which is which is a part that used to be part of Georgia, but now it's independent. Then to Russia, and literally bring the food and things like that in. But now they're after the special military operation, they're doing much better. They're getting a lot of aid from Russia. Russia is rebuilding a lot of buildings that were destroyed by the Ukraine's ATO operation, anti-terrorism operation, which is where they just go and drone random buildings, kind of like what the US did.
Like Israel's doing, yeah.
Yeah. So people have suffered a lot. It's untold suffering. And the Nazi paramilitary groups like Azov. I interviewed a priest who was sent to this place called in the basement of the Mariupol airport. They called it the library. So they tortured people in the most horrific ways. They'd pull out their fingers. All the torture devices were horrific. One prisoner actually committed suicide because he couldn't handle the torture. And I interviewed a priest who was tortured there. He was in Nikolaeva, which is a little bit east than Mariupol. And basically he was guarding it was an ancient church, and he was guarding the historical landmark. But because he was a Russian Orthodox priest, they said that he was collaborating with Russia. And then they arrested him, and then they looted a lot of those ancient historical artifacts that he was storing inside the church. They took him to the basement of the Mariupol terminal, where they tortured him for a long time. And so people are suffering, but you don't hear about all the suffering that was done under the paramilitary gangs that the Ukraine used. You only hear the one-sided Putin, whatever, the most ridiculous one with Mariupol was when they accused Putin, Russians, of eating all the zoo animals. And I actually asked, in my documentary, you can see it. I actually asked the zookeeper, did anyone eat all the animals? And they were like, only one cow was sacrificed because there was a lion that needed food. So no people ate it, but one cow was killed in the zoo, was killed for the lion to have food. But other than that, no, all the animals are there, and now they're getting fed and very well taken care of. So with Russia, with the US media, there's just atrocity propaganda, but then there's also invisible victims. So if the victim is on Russia's side or is part of Donetsk Republic or Lugansk, they're not going to talk about it. They're not talking about the Tornado Battalion. They're not talking about the Azov Battalion and how they carved swastikas onto people's chests when they tortured people, whatnot, how people were disappeared, etc. But they are making up atrocities that don't exist, that Russia didn't really do on the Ukraine side. And so the baby kidnapping. Actually, Ukraine has this ambulance force called the White Angels that actually threaten families to evacuate to the Ukrainian side. So why would people want to evacuate to the Russian side? So they get more benefits, they get higher pensions, they get better schools. They don't teach that. One book that I saw was very shocking. It was a children's book, alphabet book. I really don't remember what A stood for, but B stood for Bandera. Stefan Bandera. And Stepan Bandera was and his gang of UPA people were so horrific that literally Wehrmacht officers complained to Himmler about how brutal they are. So imagine you just if your brutality is shocking Wehrmacht officers, you must be really, really brutal. And they said Bandera is a hero of Ukraine, blah 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 blah. And I was like, and then if for a little kid, he wouldn't know. Like, what year did that state begin? 1941.
I mean, it's the same kind of indoctrination, that we see in the States when it comes to, the so-called founding fathers. Like, George Washington is an example. Like, I remember even being, in kindergarten and first grade, and the teachers talking about how George Washington couldn't tell a lie. And even then, at like 6 years old,
exterminated entire Haudenosaunee villages. So even if he was always truthful, exterminating entire Haudenosaunee villages is pretty bad.
For sure. Absolutely. But my point is, like, even as a child who lied, because I was 6 years old, was thinking, how the heck did this guy never lie if he was also a kid like me? That doesn't make any sense at all. Like, I lied to my mom about if I stole, $1 out of her purse or whatever. Like, there's no way this guy didn't do that. But anyway, that goes to show you, it's the same kind of level of indoctrination where they try to take these heroes or heroes, quote unquote, and put them on pedestals. Monsters, genocidal monsters, Nazis.
What's really interesting is that everyone I interviewed, so many people I interviewed in Donetsk, talked about the plight of Native Americans, and somebody said reservations are like modern day concentration camps. So they were very well aware of what happened to the First Nations and all the genocide and things like that. But when your hero is a Nazi, they have to kind of say, "Oh, he wasn't so bad." Blah blah blah. He didn't exterminate entire villages until the tap water ran blood, things like that.
Yeah, really, really abhorrent shit. But I don't know. I have to commend you, for being somebody who actually, went there and just talked to people, because we don't see that in the West. Western journalists, especially when it comes to Ukraine, they stay on the Ukrainian side.
Yep,
they don't go anywhere.
Monitored by, you can see, like, they're inside, embedded with the army. They don't speak the language. B, right. They don't, they only go where the army takes them, and they don't explore on their own. When I went there, like, no one was with me. I just went and asked people, and I got more and more stories, and I collected it. And I will compile it into a documentary soon, but it is, you can see, because like, literally they interviewed this mayor of this town in northwest of Ukraine, in Ivano-Frankivsk. And he literally had a Bandera portrait in his office. They didn't even think, who is it? Why does he have that portrait? And then you see all sorts of these, like, Ukrainian soldiers having, like, the Sonarand and Nazi symbols, and none of them ask anything about it. So a lot of Western journalists just kind of repeat what Ukraine also has a media outreach center that gives pre-edited videos. And I've seen the New York Times literally use one of these pre-edited videos that they downloaded from it, as opposed to go do their own research, which is not what a journalist does.
Of course. You see it all the time, even with some of the embedded soldiers in on the Ukrainian side. I've seen videos where reporters will fake being shot at, or that there's drones, and they, like, run into a ditch and nothing, and then they'll have, like, another angle that someone took where, like, nothing's happening. And it's like, I mean, talking about privilege, that you have to pretend to get shot at while people in Donetsk are being shelled. In Donetsk,
every few minutes I hear some drone coming in. And I was there for a long enough time that I kind of later started to ignore those drone missiles. Like, it didn't scare me. But I went to this apartment with this old lady. Her husband was severely injured. I don't know what happened to him, but a drone hit the apartment building, and, like, 30, like, on one side of the building, like, was just broken, unlivable. And then I actually met this boy who was a drone hit his bedroom when he was asleep, and he lost a leg.
Yeah, I saw that part. Yeah. Young kid. I mean, he was what, maybe 13, 12. 14 when you were talking to him? 12?
No. He was 12 when it happened. He was 13 when I interviewed him.
Right. Yeah. And just this kid, lost his leg. And you know what I noticed when watching that scene is how he had what looked to me, as a medical professional, a pretty advanced prosthetic. And I was thinking about how in the US, like, you can't get something like that unless you have money.
Oh yeah, he was flown to no, not flown, taken on. He trained to Moscow, and there's a special hospital that really specializes in advanced prosthetics, and he was fit with that there.
Mm-hmm. No, I just thought, right. Well, that's my point. Is like in the United States, if you lose your limb,
prosthetic leg cost?
Well, we can look it up, but what I'm saying is, like, most people don't. They either just won't get one, or they'll get something that's really unusable. Like, I watched that kid ride a bike. No, I just thought that was, something quite remarkable. So another thing I want to kind of to round off with, is like, conditions in the United States are getting worse and worse. We essentially saw a lame duck Democratic Party for 4 years. And don't get me wrong, both sides are absolute, capitalist pigs. But we basically saw a lame duck Democratic Party flounder for 4 years, enable genocide, and just handed power to they're even worse opposites, like it was nothing, and now are crying and pooping their pants because Trump and the Republicans are trying to pass all this kind of legislation. Like I just saw yesterday, they're basically making any diversity hires or promotions illegal. They're already started
rolling back the 1965 Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to challenge the 14th Amendment, which is what gives citizens their birthright in the States, which is just like open door to fascism, because then that's just like, if you want to be a citizen, you got to join the army or some bullshit like that. So they're basically just doing all these abhorrent things that we knew was going to happen. And the Democrats just handed them literally the election and handed them the power. But basically, with multipolarity, however you want to call it, with the world moving away from the US dollar, the de-dollarization, other countries that are being able to break the chains of imperialism and are moving in a different direction, we're only seeing the United States crumble in 4K, so like, is there any conversations about this going on in the other parts of the world? Like in your experience, or is everyone just kind of like, well, we're just going to ignore the US as it crumbles?
Sadly, I just made this comment about how China and Russia don't engage in enough anti-American propaganda. Mm-hmm. So most of the internal US decay goes uncovered. They do talk about US intervention, US military, US foreign policy, et cetera, a lot. So, yeah, unfortunately, the domestic decay, it just goes uncovered.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense, because the domestic isn't so much going to affect other people around the world, but
it doesn't make sense. I mean, there's a lot of Russian liberals who still idealize the U.S. and eat up all the U.S. talking points. So they do need to cover more domestic strife in the U.S. and what's going on within the U.S. more. So that's
right. Well, what I was going to say is, like, and at least in my opinion, really, until it gets like absolute, like, we think it's bonkers now, and it definitely will get worse, then we'll probably, other places will hear about it. I hear what you're saying, but yeah, I don't know. It's really funny, in a way, because the United States tried to clamp down so hard on the perceived misinformation, the perceived Chinese propaganda.
Oh, no, it's not misinformation. What they're clamping down on is information, because their propaganda is not that effective when people kind of understand the framework and the lies and whatnot. So they're actually clamping down. I've looked at so many things, like when they've accused Russia of misinformation, but then when you read what Russia said, it's the absolute 100%
Right. Well, that's why I said perceived misinformation. Like, that's what they think it is, or that's how they're trying to promote it.
No,
I get it.
They know it is information. They just don't, which makes their misinformation less effective. But that's the excuse that they're giving for the gullible liberal public to eat it up and be forced.
For sure. Yeah. But I digress. That it's funny watching like the US do this giant publicity stunt with TikTok because they didn't want Americans to see anymore. This whole ban occurred, one, so the US can try to maintain its monopoly on information, but two, because so many people in the United States were seeing what was happening in Palestine.
Gaza.
In Gaza, yeah, and seeing genocide basically happening live, and the United States, can't have that because
some of it literally were the Israeli soldiers who were so shameless that they put it up.
Yes, yeah. I saw tons of that, and it did make my heart happy when I would see like Israeli soldier memorial posts, and all the comments were just people being like "R.I.P. Bozo," because people fuck those guys. But anyway. So the U.S. tries to ban this app. Well, they didn't try to ban it because it was a publicity stunt, but basically they turned the app off for 12 hours, and everybody went to the Chinese Red app.
Oh my God,
Red app.
That
the
is
Chinese app, Red
to many Americans. That was an epiphany. They were like,
yes.
"Oh my God!" In China, employers on top of pay have to give housing and food. I had no idea.
What really like got to me, I think it'll make you laugh, is like I was seeing people like shocked that like people in China have a sense of humor, or like will post memes or their own jokes, or like just like brain rot, like whatever nonsense joke, like videos, and it's like, yeah, man, they're people. What do you mean?
Every country has their sense of humor, very advanced usually.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I always find Russian humor to be more advanced, and for all his criticisms, Zelensky is a very, very good comedian.
Is he really? I haven't.
He's the best comedian. He's very funny. He was very funny, and it's kind of. I should do a compilation of President Zelensky versus comedian Zelensky, because comedian Zelensky critiqued everything perfectly. Like he talked about Ukraine being NATO henchmen. He all talked about the American mercenaries. Everything, but and then like once there was he talked about the new Ukrainian police that he got in through nepotism, and then they end up blowing up all these buildings accidentally, and then he's like, "Oh, America will pay for the police equipment. Let's not worry." So he created. He was his comedy is strong leftist against but everything that President Zelensky does. As comedian Zelensky, he was against it.
Alter ego. The under the influence of the IMF and the United States.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and if he portrays the country, the Nazis will go after him for sure.
I mean, they already did, and that's when in the beginning he was going to like tone down the Azov brigades, etc., and then the Azov threatened to shoot him, and that spooked him, so that he became more mainstream.
Yeah, I remember when that happened, but yeah, it's incredible that the way the United States is trying so hard to do misinformation, to convince people domestically that the United States is the only correct path, it is the only way to go, it is the best nation in the world. But by inadvertently trying to do this publicity stunt, take away this app from people then were finally confronted with what for us is common sense reality, that Chinese people are just people and have their own opinions, and you can just talk to them and it's not that big of a deal. So, I've also been seeing like a lot of people talking about like liberals even being like, let's go there, let's just meet people and just like hang out and whatever. And it's like, yeah, it really, being well traveled, it really removes so much of that propaganda the United States really tries to put on people, because then you just see it. I don't know how else to put it.
I mean, yes, and also like learning to look at numbers. For example, I knew. First of all, it was so obvious. Even in 2014, when the Maidan was going on, there were Nazis because they had all sorts of Nazi paraphernalia, and I saw some of them. It was like not that hard. And then, like, when I looked at what the IMF, the coup government agreed to with the IMF, I was like, okay, this is a coup because nobody is going to protest. Viktor Yanukovych basically in January of 2014 raised both pension and minimum wage. Who's going to protest that and say, I want a lower minimum wage, I want less pension? Right. So it's clear that this is not the majority. So majority don't support it. In fact, when Maidan was going on, there was an anti-Maidan in a nearby park that was supporting Viktor Yanukovych. That didn't get Western news coverage. But then when you look at what the IMF does, who on earth, what kind of crazy person would want lower pensions, higher prices to heat their homes, less salary, privatization of resources, deindustrialization? Like, what sane person would want that? They wouldn't. So that's when you know it's a coup. But people don't look at the numbers. They don't look at how much the structural adjustment program is going to lower the minimum wage, lower the average wages, et cetera. So if you ignore the propaganda and just look at the numbers, you can get a pretty good idea of what people what would be popular amongst the people.
For sure. So I guess we can end it off here with this sort of open-ended question, which I feel like is a really obvious answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So with third world countries moving away from the United States, this de-dollarization, this instability of the United States, I guess sort of generally, like, what do you think is going to happen, like, even within the next 10 years of geopolitics?
Well, when countries are sovereign, they end up helping their citizens a lot, and there's a lot of much needed development. And sovereign and citizens who are free to exercise democracy that is not constrained by the IMF will move to more social democratic systems, even socialist systems, because there isn't that violent arm that's constraining them. So that's basically what will happen if if they manage to avoid the thousands of attempted coups and the empire. As Gramsci said, the old world is dying. The new world is struggling to be born. Now is the time for monsters. So the empire is going to get much more vicious with their violence and their attempted destabilization at these countries. So these countries better be prepared. With Burkina Faso, I always worry Ibrahim Traore, they now built gold refineries. So instead of just exporting raw gold, they're exporting processed gold. So they're getting much more money from the world trade paradigm. I always worry he's going to go in the way of Thomas Sankara. Yeah.
I mean, it's I don't want to say it's bound for happen to him, but it's stuff like that is going to keep happening, and it's going to ramp up as the U.S. is trying to avoid its own demise.
Exactly. So it's going to get more belligerent, more violent. It'll get more reckless with its attempt. It's not going to try to keep its hands clean, as in as secret coups, but their involvement might be open and more brazen and more violent, etc.
Yeah, I mean, even now, when Trump is talking about invading Panama, invading Greenland, invading Canada, like, that's what falling apart fascist countries try to do. That's what failing empires try to do. Not that I think they're in any position to do that today,
to Greenland or Canada or Mexico. But destabilization will continue. Like Ecuador, for example, they literally have a CEO of a banana corporation as president. And this was after they couped Rafael Correa. And this guy basically allows Southcom, which is a faction of the U.S. military, to operate and do operations right outside of Ecuador. And what's really frightening is they're kind of doing a lava jato-like campaign against anyone who dissents. Like the former vice president of Ecuador, they claim that he was he did because he built some road during an earthquake. He embezzled money or something, and it's bullshit. It's exactly like lava jato in Brazil, but it's in a much higher scale. So those are the things we have to watch about, is what he doesn't talk about. They'll
Right.
say wild things. You should not pay attention to that, but you should look at the actions. Where is the Southcom? Where is Africom? What about ECOWAS in Africa? Like those things that he's not talking about. That's where the horror is going to be increased.
For sure. For sure. Is there anything you want to plug real quick?
No.
All right.
Just check out historically.net. And my book is going to come out eventually. So it's about the true history of the Soviet Union. Because people in America, it's so sad, even leftists, like many of them are like authoritarian. Like they don't understand how it's literally illiterate peasants who overthrow the Tsar and then fought 14 different empires in order to get the right to have basic things like their children going to school instead of working in mines, education, food, etc. And especially the era of Stalin. Stalin is most demonized because of this. But that is the biggest growth in the standard of living humanity's ever had was during Stalin's era.
Yeah, 100%. And you're absolutely right. This is why I don't particularly like the term leftist over here, in the West, because that really can mean anything. Usually just means liberal, in my opinion, where once you start talking about social revolution or, having to, storm the palace, going back to that, a lot of leftists here, especially on the internet, are like, no, you can't do that. That's authoritarian. And I'm like, what's authoritarian? Living under the boot under empire.
Can I show you something? Just give me 1 minute. I'm going to read an excerpt from Cham's book. Okay. So here are examples of non-authoritarian revolutionary action. I'm reading from his book. What is far more important is that these ideas have been realized in spontaneous revolutionary example. For example, in Germany and Italy after World War I and in Spain. Because they were not authoritarian, what happened after those 10 days? Italy got Mussolini. It's like those are like literally all those quote unquote non-authoritarian anarchist revolutions. Germany and Italy weren't anarchist. Italy was. Germany wasn't. Germany was led by the Spartacus, but that sounds to me an example of. And Spain. Spain had Franco. Mussolini, Hitler. Like that sounds like revolutions. You should not you should look at and learn what not to do, because that's the worst possible outcome.
Exactly, because just like how von Hindenburg handed power to Hitler, in a lot of ways Democrats just handed power.
A documentary about that on our channel.
Okay, but just like how that happened, the Democrats who are aligned more or less with Republicans and literally are just like, all right, buddy, here's the power. See you later. Like you can't talk about how this guy is an existential threat and then give him the presidency. That's ridiculous. But
exactly. Yeah. No. Well, with Hitler, literally industrialists gave him keys to the kingdom.
Yes, they sure did.
A whole bunch of rich and corporate power, basically. Mussolini too. Same thing. No one elected either of them. So in the West, what I notice is that a lot of these lib socialists, anarchists, whatever, they idolize losers. Like they're like, oh, Rosa Luxemburg shot. I love Salvador Allende, but
bro got clapped. He got clapped because he did not listen to Fidel when he was like, hey, bro, listen, you might have to use some of your own police to kind of check things out. No, I don't need to do that. But I'm sorry. I laughed because I love how you phrase that. They do. They idolize losers who did not accomplish what they set out to do or were eliminated by the bourgeois state or the United States.
Yeah, and the winners are always considered authoritarian, but maybe these people are winners because they took these actions that were necessary, and that's why these people are losers. Like Stalin purged some Tsarist generals. Salvador Allende did not purge the old guard of generals, and he got shot by Pinochet. So that's kind of what they can't compare, is that ultimately, according to the West, winning is authoritarian. And if you win, basically, they'll defame you till no end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a really, really great place to end it here. But yeah, go ahead and check out Historically. I'll put all the links down in the description when this is up, and talk to you guys later.
Bye-bye.